You know, as a prelude to this conversation, I was actually supposed to go see my first launch this week, Vandenberg, right up the coast, and I think they postponed it, or I wasn't paying attention. But now there's two at the end of the month. Has anybody here seen a launch before? I'm like kid in a candy store excited.
Yeah, I've been to see the Falcon 9, and I got to view it from the historic shuttle viewing tower.
Sweet.
Yeah, it was, I think, the closest you can get to the launch. And what was kind of incredible is the reverberation that you expect is like there's this time delay. This is your first launch. I don't want to set any expectations.
Yeah, awesome. I'm excited. We all, as a child of the 80s, I think there was a little bit of trauma many of us had growing up if we were watching some of the launches in school. And the most recent one, I said I'm watching my son with a little time delay. Well, look, we can start chatting. People can file in and out as they see fit. Listeners, if you want to hit me up in the DMs, feel free. Ask a question. I can pass along to the rest of the crew. We're talking about space today, which, there's probably no more industry that elicits this sort of fanboy interest than our world. And so, for a long time, I think people assumed it was just the purview of the big governments, but that seems to be changing. So to get a start, let's do a little around the world. I'll start with you, Andrew. 2020 has been a little weird. I think a lot of people would like to escape the planet if they could. There's 2 months left. Talk to us about why, if there's so many problems here, why should both investors and people be thinking about space?
Well, I think there's an incredible amount of reasons that we don't have the time to get into today for why people should be looking at or considering space investment. But like you said, there are so many problems here. Why focus on space? And it's something that I hear, unfortunately, regularly. And I think it's because there's a very strong misunderstanding of what space is, how it affects our lives, and why we need it today and for the future. And some of these things that people will point to, the problems on Earth are things like people not able to get fresh and clean drinking water. People in certain areas, food deserts or other places where they're unable to grow fresh produce. And even something that most of us take for granted today is shelter, just having a place to stay that's safe. And if you look at space travel, and where we're looking out in the future for bringing the space industry, these are all major, extremely important factors that we'll also have to consider when going into outer space. And many times when NASA spends or invests in outer space, these are investments that have multiple fold returns for not just NASA, but in many cases, humanity. And so if we're able to start building permanent colonies on the moon, Mars, beyond, these same issues of finding fresh water, of being able to regrow produce so that we don't have to send everything from Earth to outer space that we're going to need to consume, and even building supportive structures that can enable humanity to survive in inhospitable places. There's a very good chance that we could take those technologies, if solved for outer space, and bring them back home to help us here. So that's just kind of one little pocket of how space, I think, is misunderstood, and how investing in space is also misunderstood for similar reasons.
All right, 2 minutes in, we're already going Mars colonies. I like it. Sam, you guys are famous, your company, for disruption, innovation. Why is space one of the areas you guys pick out to focus on, invest in, carve out a certain niche in?
Yeah, so with disruption, one of the key things we look for is those crazy cost declines you get with technology. And that's happening across a number of vectors in the space industry. So you have rocket launches that are coming down in cost because of larger rockets and because of reusability. You have satellite costs that are coming down, kind of riding the wave of consumer electronics and more powerful and smaller satellites. And then you also have that end user terminal cost that's coming down from hundreds of thousands of dollars and mechanically operated to digital phased array antennas. And, to Andrew's point, it's cross-sector. It touches way more of our lives than people think, but it's kind of out of sight, out of mind. And, we like to think about space, not just as outer space and orbital space, but really anything off the ground. We're starting to see drones really take off, air taxis, and then those enabling technologies that are also sharing and helping with those cost declines. So we're seeing 3D printing really taking hold in the aerospace industries as well.
So we'll kick it over to you, Lisa. You've probably been more involved in longer history than anyone on this panel, maybe combined. And an interesting part of your history with Hemisphere, which I figure is where we'll start, I feel like a lot of people listening, tuning into this, would just assume that space is dominated by, again, the governments, but also the huge multinational companies, and the concept of private and earlier stage investing is a myth. Talk to us a little bit about your approach and what you've been up to for the past handful of years.
Sure. Thank you. Well, with Hemisphere Ventures, we've been investing in space since 2014. We have about 20 companies in our space portfolio. And I think one of the things that isn't shared is really just how space touches every aspect of our lives even today. So that the simplest things that people don't think about because they're just integral to our life, having the cell phone where we're ordering an Uber, that's enabled by a geosatellite. Being on a plane and having a movie via Wi-Fi, that communication capability is with satellites. So the space sector is communication and observation opportunities for innovation in these areas. And it's really the data that we bring back from space that informs how we can improve our lives on Earth. It's not just the maps that we can bring back and the logistics that we can improve, but companies like big insurance companies are stepping in and understanding that they can do modeling with insights from the data that they bring back from space. And of course, insurance companies are involved in the sector because they need to insure the space launches and payloads that are sent to space. So it really does touch on the R&D arena. Sam was mentioning 3D printing, of course, is a big need for space. Any type of additive manufacturing or the ability to not have to launch a product but assemble it in space or build it in space will be a need of the future. And whether or not we're building things on a space station, the capability of building something with these low-cost platforms like to grow food from a vat or some type of thing instead of having or new materials where we can grow them and build them instead of manufacture them with big manufacturing plants really speaks to the efficiencies and the value chains and supply chains that we can achieve on Earth. So there's a lot to be achieved with our space data, even in areas I've mentioned on your show, Meb, talking about space weather and how space weather informs us of Earth weather, and wouldn't we all like to have better weather prediction modeling? So we're sending a lot of small instruments to space that can bring valuable data back. And so there's a really an explosion of companies working on sensors and getting more of them out in space to be networked, and all of that is going to improve our lives here on Earth ultimately.
Yeah, it's. I've been following you for years, and it feels certainly magical. The old phrase of any technology that's sufficiently awesome is indistinguishable from magic. Let's go back around the panel. I want to talk to you guys again, and feel free to use specific examples or use cases. After all, the name of this panel is "Why do you need to make space for space in your portfolio, not just your life?" Although, Lisa, I was smiling as you were talking about Wi-Fi on a plane. I mean, who flies anymore? I might actually be taking my first. Right. I might be taking my first flight Friday. So wish me luck. Okay, Andrew, let's wrap back around. You have a space-focused ETF, great ticker symbol in the background, UFO. The cool thing about your fund, as I was perusing the holdings, in my mind, and I think in probably a lot of investors' minds, they would expect it to be, Lockheed, Boeing, Northrop. But reality, you look at a lot of the top 10 holdings, I've never even heard of many of them. Talk to us a little bit about how you guys put together this fund, this portfolio, thematics, all that good stuff.
So the underlying index that the fund tracks is co-developed by a former director of the Space Foundation. And it was a project that he was working on over there before they decided that they didn't necessarily want to get into financial markets and making indexes and potentially picking companies that would be included. And so he was able to go off and work with us as well as an index partner, S Network, to build out what this space index would include. And for us, you mentioned these large aerospace and defense companies that people are very familiar with and are extremely large and relevant players in the space industry, but space might not be their major focus. And from creating many different ETFs over the past, to me, it was always important to, if you're going to launch a product whose theme is in the name, for us, the Procure Space ETF, it was important that people were getting exposure to companies, ideally ones that also had pure play exposure. So the way that the index took that into account was what it looks for is revenues from space companies. So companies that are deriving over 50% of their revenues from space-related activities and services and products. And those would be considered pure play companies, but also realizing the importance of some of these major diversified aerospace and defense names and understanding that there should be some spot in there because they are such big players in the space industry. There's actually a cap. So the pure play companies will represent at least 80% of the index. Whereas these more diversified aerospace and defense names can represent in total up to 20% of the index. So it gives you an ability to get exposure to these pure play names whose fortunes or failures will ride on their majority of their space related business lines, as opposed to necessarily something where Boeing, which is a holding currently, something that saw tremendous impact from issues with one of their airliners, something that's not necessarily space related in our mind, that brought the stock down a bit earlier in the year. Something like that is a scenario that you want to try to mitigate, but still include into the fund. So you'll notice a representation of over 30 publicly traded companies from around the world specializing in all different areas beyond just aerospace and defense. So you do have communications, and many people believe that broadband internet may be one of these very large drivers in the future for the space industry. And you just look at things like 5G and cloud computing and the Internet of Things and connected devices and the amount of data that's going to need to be transferred from point A to point B over time. And many people don't realize how important satellites and satellite systems are in these related industries as well. So you actually get, back to Sam's point about these various intersections and vectors of different industries, you get this exposure of the many different things happening around the world and beyond by investing in something potentially like UFO.
I got some follow-up questions for you, but we're going to keep going around the circle for a minute. You actually answered one of the DM questions. Sam, how do you guys approach it in your suite of funds, managed accounts, mutual funds, all that good stuff? How's the space theme implemented? And then what sort of ideas or spots are you guys excited about?
Yeah, so right now, space is part of our autonomous technology and robotics fund. We also sub-advise a fund just that is space focused. And to kind of tie back to what I was mentioning earlier, the way we really frame it is, you have orbital aerospace, you've got suborbital aerospace, you've got those enablers, and then you have the beneficiaries. And so, if we're looking in orbital aerospace, you have those satellite operators. I think, Iridium's an interesting one that often gets very misunderstood. One, because of its precarious history and, emergence from bankruptcy, and then just the confusion with Starlink and what's happening with broadband versus the L band where they operate, which is, potentially very interesting for these remote applications and Internet of Things. They're partnering with Amazon Web Services and doing some very interesting things there, as well as with drones. So that's getting into that suborbital aerospace. And we look at companies like JD.com or Amazon that their entire business model could really transform. And, people look at Amazon and they've seen tremendous growth for the past decade and think, eventually this does have to stop. But, we still think there's this extra leg. If all of a sudden you have drone delivery for packages and the cost, drops to maybe 20 cents for a drone delivery, not only does that lower Amazon's costs, but actually increases the uptake of e-commerce. Maybe you're not going to the corner store to pick up some last minute items for a meal. Instead, you're just at home and, you're calling for this drone delivery. And tying in there, I think JD is particularly interesting because aerospace is definitely more tied into government regulations. And so China is definitely, I would say, leading the way as far as being open to autonomous flight and drone technology. And I won't talk for too much longer, but just going into the 3D printing space is one of the key enablers. You're about to take your first flight on Friday. Wear the N95 mask, not just the regular one. But you have companies that are just 3D printing some plastic pieces right now, which are end components, and that lowers the weight of the plane, which has huge impacts for the operating profits of those airlines. And it's really just the early days of that, and we could see huge penetration of these end-use parts from 3D printers, like Stratasys, like Materialize, and I'll end it there so we can keep
Sam,
going.
We got a DM question. Which ETF features the most space exposure that you guys have in the U.S. that people can access?
Yes, the ARKQ is the autonomous technology and robotics one.
Got it. I was smiling as you're talking about Iridium. I wrote a college university article. I remember like one of my, like a thesis, not even a thesis, but a paper on Iridium 20 years ago. So, and it's funny also you mentioned Amazon as you were saying that. I said, Jeff's got a little space company kicking around too. We'll see what he does with that. All right, Lisa.
Yeah.
Let's talk a little bit about, you can either do profile a company or two that you've been involved with, and then I want to hop and save a little time for what you're up to today.
Sure, thank you. I think that there are so many things happening on the startup arena, versus the farther down the chain with Andrew and Sam working on more the public market space. We're seeing things that are just getting started, right? So we're really at that hub of innovation, the point where they're making these groundbreaking discoveries. And the question is, can these companies scale? Can they integrate? And so we're finding big players like Microsoft with Azure or Amazon Web Services getting involved in trying to be looking at ground station capabilities and, of course, compute capabilities. And they're starting to partner with some of our startups. So we have one called Kubos, Kubos, and it's autonomous capability to do mission and flight control for satellites. So it's like the Intel inside, if you will. And obviously we're going to have more satellites. You don't want to have to start from scratch to build software to control your satellites if you can just plug that capability in. And so it's nice to see big companies starting to recognize these capabilities of small companies. Separately, Axiom Space is in our portfolio. They're building the world's first commercial space station. And there's so much to say about the future for a private space station. There will be private astronauts going to space, but it's not just the astronaut that goes to space. They're bringing, if they're sovereigns, they're bringing their nation along with them. If they're American, they're bringing, American brands or companies that want them to achieve things on the space station with them. So that speaks to then the corporate interest in having a presence on the space station or R&D. So we've talked in the past about how we expect to have these future platforms allowing for R&D that would be, specifically research for Pfizer or for Merck. And certainly with COVID, I think things are advancing in all directions for the needs that we have for discovery. So perhaps that might fuel some of the future space research. I don't know. But also, as Sam was mentioning in the drone space, we're seeing one of our companies that I'm not as close to, but we have invested a long time ago, Valancy, getting contracts from the government to work on that autonomous delivery of vaccines. So, our current state of affairs is definitely playing into business models, and certain companies will benefit from that. So it will be interesting to see how that all plays out.
Yeah, it's kind of like reading an Asimov novel, and I imagine in the not too distant future when Jim is not so cruel and gives us more than 30 minutes to chat on this panel, that many of Lisa's portfolio companies end up being in Sam and Andrew's ETFs as they graduate to the public markets, some of them going that way quicker than others. All right, we have less than 10 minutes, so sadly, some of the DMs that I'd love to get to, such as what happens to commodity prices if we mine an asteroid? What happens if we militarize space? You guys feel free to answer, by the way. But I wanted to make sure we touch everyone once more and say, what are you most excited about? Or if there's anything on the horizon that is on your brain that you haven't touched on, here's your chance to talk about it. Andrew, start with you and work around the table.
This actually ties into one of those DMs that you were referring to, and I think it is important to mention. And it might not be something that I'm excited for. It's maybe something that maybe I'm a little bit more fearful for because we're in the early stages. But the buildup of the militarization and defensive space is something that I think should be more broadly discussed and on everyone's radar, because we have seen allies and adversaries from around the world start to relay at least some of what they want to discuss about what their plan is for advancement in outer space. And right now, there's no one that's currently building out a fully livable colony on the moon. But as China has already mentioned that's in their fairly immediate plans to start progress on something like that. And if another country is already on the moon and starting to harvest resources and stake out claims, if you just really start to play out the game theory there, you could see something start to build up much quicker in this new kind of space race mentality. And that is something that could have tremendous implications, not just how countries, but how companies and individuals get to interact with space. So it's something that needs to be done and taken care of and figured out and agreed to by a huge amount of potential players. But it is something that could lead to significantly increased spending towards the militarization and defensive space. And I think that's kind of one undershadowed area that people aren't really looking at. People want to look about the great progress that we can make in space with internet and communications and things like that and manufacturing. But there could be this other major driver that comes from governments and military powers trying to stake out their claim in this vast and new domain.
Yeah. Sam, we're going to head to you. And also would love to hear you speak to really either of you guys. Are any of these companies profitable? One of the DMs was said, all I can think about when I think about space is massive, expensive, a huge R&D budget. But are we at a point yet where any of these companies actually make any money?
Yeah, so I'll start with most excited and then go on to profitability. I think in the pretty near term, I'm very excited for air taxis. Electric vertical takeoff, landing air taxis. I think, I hate sitting in traffic, and we'll get autonomous cars, and that'll be great and lower costs, but potentially increase traffic by a lot more. And, being able to go from downtown to an airport in 20 minutes for the cost of a taxi today really excites me personally. And then on the profitability side, I think it's kind of a mix across the spectrum. To what you were saying earlier, a lot of innovation is being done in these larger companies that are more established, more profitable, and they have a history of really, pushing the frontier. I think Lockheed Martin is a pretty good example of a company that's at the technological edge. They're doing 3D printing themselves. But then I'd also think it's interesting And I'd like to hear Lisa's opinion on this too, but there's this interesting match of the private world with space companies and the public world, because a lot of times it does require a long investment cycle that doesn't always line up with the venture capital timeline. So we've spoken to a lot of companies who are actually exploring the public market at an earlier stage because they've gone to VCs, and if the VCs fund has a 7 to 10 year timeline, that's no good for the VC, and there's a huge opportunity for this company, but they need access to that capital to make it happen.
Lisa, let's hear it. Also want to hear, it's like the Hair Club for Men. You're not just an investor, you're a founder too.
I am. Well, so I have this theory on the timelines that's kind of maybe it's my dream scenario. I don't know. But I think that we really can't necessarily fit into the venture model of the 10-year timeline. Some companies can, but it's really difficult. And so how do you get that investment for the longer term? And it's the more patient capital. And so there's been a resurgence of family offices trying to assess how they can build space into their portfolios and task their managers to find opportunities. So I'm excited about that. And then separately, there's been energy coming out of the hedge fund sector where larger hedge funds are saying, here's a chunk of change for your entire round. We're actually seeing them scoop up entire rounds. So they're almost skipping the traditional venture model. And I think we have great value that VCs provide, but there's this oil and water, I think, between the model for space and the model that VCs require. So, and I find myself struggling with that. And so I like the idea that there can be larger capacity for fundraising with maybe future thinkers in these areas like hedge funds and family offices. So that's kind of the momentum I'm seeing happening. In terms of my activities, I separately run a space company, Explore, and we are disrupting space with our model for offering space as a service, where typically companies are buying hardware in order to go to space. They're buying software in order to go to space. And in our case, they are renting space on our spacecraft, and we're hosting their payloads for them and their instruments so they can be pointed, navigated, and tasked. And that's a capability that makes space easier and allows for more people to go to space. So that's what I love is my work with Explore and opening the doors for accessing space and maybe lowering the cost of space, because as you kind of alluded to, well, isn't there all of this cost in creating spacecraft? And what's happening as well is that components have scaled and they're largely available. And so components can be purchased now and assembled, and spacecraft can be created, but you don't really want to be the person doing that if that's not your area of expertise, and all you really want to do is get data back from space. Then you come to a company like Explore and we help get you going.
Awesome. I'm excited to see your progress in the coming months and years. Sadly, we got to start to wind this down, team. As a reminder to the audience, there's going to be a short lunch break and then the space keynote back on the main stage at 1:30 Eastern time. Big thank you to the panelists. We got Andrew at Procure ETFs, Sam at ARC Funds, Lisa at Hemisphere Ventures and Explore. Please check out their websites. Email them, not me. Ask for lots more information on what they're up to. Follow along. Thanks so much, and we'll see everyone in the main stage.
Thanks, Meb.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.